I'm live. Yep. Hi, Sherry Wise. Hi, Bonnie. I guess we've got a few people here. Please share, everybody. I haven't had time to share this, but since I'm very late, okay, I'm going to go on. I don't know what the problem was tonight, or maybe I do. I think it was that for some reason Facebook dropped the login I've been using from the XSplit app, and I had to reconnect the two pieces of software. That's what the error message I got actually meant, but I had to guess at that, and it took me a little time to figure it out. Kay says, I came back at the perfect time. Laugh out loud. This debate in Congress has been getting on last nerve all day. And she says, laugh out loud. Good to see you. So thanks. And Sherry White says hi. Hi, Sherry. I've heard a lot about you from Lana. I'm told there's a lot of echo. I better make sure that I'm set right for the broadcast. Okay, how's the echo now? Let me know if I still have an echo, please. Okay, do I still have an echo? Please let me know. Okay, I'm still trying to get rid of the echo. Oh, My settings must have been disturbed by the new setup. So I'm told I have an echo. Sherry says not now. Sherry says not now. How's my echo, Bonnie? Hi, Dolores. Nice to see you. Bonnie says I still have an echo, which means I probably do, but I have all my visible sources of echo. Hang on just 1 second. Hi, Dolores. Nice to see you. I need some more feedback on the echo. I'm getting conflicting feedbacks, and I don't want to go ahead with a complex stream without knowing that my sound is all right. So please do what you can for me. I appreciate it. Huh? Okay, Bonnie says I have to talk a little so you can tell. So I'm going to talk. Okay, Bonnie says I have to talk a little, so I'm talking a little. Any more echoes? Say no, please, if there are no echoes. Say yes if there still are. Okay, I assume I've gotten rid of them now. Maybe that'll tone it down a bit. Anyway, I'm about to start. So tonight's topic, as I think you know, is how do we get to zero carbon and pay for it, part 2. Maybe I should say part duh. Okay? Thank you for your feedback. So I'm going to go ahead now. If anybody's still having problem, I now think I know the possible source of the problem. Should be better now. Okay. So, I wanted to go through another two of the American Prospect articles from that second issue. And I've given you links, certainly. And the first article I want to cover is the technical path to zero carbon. It's a lot closer than many skeptics think. And the author is actually Mara Prentice. It was written on December 5th, 2019. 1 week ago now. And she's better on the technical side than Jeffrey Sachs, I should say. Not Jerry Sachs, Jeffrey Sachs. But anyway, what she says is, quite apart from our goals for a rapid energy transition, for a rapid green energy transition, any discussion of the rate at which we should convert to 100% renewable energy requires that the laws of nature and invented technology cooperate. Here the news is hopeful. In scientific fact, it's entirely reasonable to conclude that the United States could transition to 100% clean energy, zero emissions economy within 30 years or less, thanks to technologies that are already available. In my estimation of the renewable energy that we must harvest, I will assume the total U.S. energy consumption will remain flat. I base the prediction on U.S. energy consumption patterns over the last 30 years, as well as the prospects for achieving major gains in energy efficiency moving forward. So that's a big assumption, of course, but let's see how it works out. To begin, we need to distinguish, quote, energy efficiency, unquote, from, quote, energy conservation, unquote. Energy conservation entails making do with less. For example, maintaining room temperature during winter at 65 degrees Fahrenheit rather than 70 degrees, or cutting back on average automobile travel from the current figure of 13,000 miles per year to, say, 8,000 miles. By contrast, improvements in energy efficiency lower the amount of energy that we use without reducing our quality of life. That seems a bit of an overstatement. I'm not sure whether if we were to reduce our home temperature during winter to 65 degrees Fahrenheit as opposed to 70 degrees, that would be much of a decline in our quality of life. I'm also not sure that reducing our current automobile travel from 13,000 miles to 8,000 miles would be much of a change in our quality of life. But your mileage may vary, as the saying goes. Realistically, she says, the opportunity to level off our future energy consumption levels rests far more with raising energy efficiency standards than assuming people will make major sacrifices in their living standards. And she's probably right about that, though I'd also amend that to say that assuming people will make major changes in their living habits rather than major sacrifices in their living standards. But anyway, for example, switching from incandescent light bulbs to LEDs makes lighting more efficient but does not reduce the amount of light that we use. But of course, it does reduce the amount of energy we use, but not the amount of light, right? Air conditioner efficiencies have dramatically improved since the 1990s and are continuing to improve. Improvements in building insulation decrease the energy required to maintain comfortable indoor temperatures. The number of miles that one can drive on a gallon of gas has increased dramatically and is continuing to increase. Hybrid cars consume less energy than fossil fuel-based cars, partly because fossil fuel-powered cars waste energy when they brake, whereas when hybrid cars brake, part of the energy is returned to the car battery. The energy stored in the car battery can then be used to drive the car forward again. Electric cars are even more energy efficient than hybrid cars, with equivalent mileage efficiencies that can exceed 100 miles per gallon. Heat pumps, amazingly, can be more than 100% energy efficient because they transfer heat energy from cold places to hot places. The energy required to operate heat pumps is the energy equivalent of a shipping and handling charge. That charge can be much lower than the value of the energy transported. When the temperature difference between cold and hot places is small, the heat energy delivered can be much larger than the electrical energy that is used. In contrast, the heat energy delivered by fossil fuel burning cannot exceed the energy contained in the fossil fuel. Since the heat delivered is typically 3 times the electricity used, using heat pumps instead of burning fossil fuels can dramatically reduce energy consumption without requiring any change in indoor temperatures. Given all of these demonstrated and projected increases in energy efficiency, it might be justifiable to assume that we can maintain our current lifestyle while our energy use is able to decline in absolute amounts over time. However, I will assume, conservatively, that gains in energy efficiency will allow us to stabilize overall energy demand at approximately our current level. Solar energy. Energy flows from the sun to the earth just as rain falls from the sky to the earth. We often say that 1 inch of rain fell in the last hour. If we collect water in a bucket after 1 hour, that bucket would contain 1 inch of water at the bottom. If there were 2 identical buckets side by side, each bucket would have 1 inch of water. The story is equivalent with solar panels. That is, for a solar panel of a particular size, the total amount of solar energy delivered per hour is given by the flow of energy per hour times the area of the solar panel. In standard units, the energy per hour delivered to 1 square meter is expressed in watts per square meter, approximately 3 feet by 3 feet. The total power delivered to any particular solar panel is therefore exactly the wattage of sunlight per area reaching the Earth's surface times the size of the solar panel. The average amount of solar power per unit area that reaches the Earth's surface varies somewhat with location, with sunnier places obviously receiving more solar power than cloudier locations. For example, in Phoenix, New Orleans, and Miami, the average solar power per unit area is about 200 watts per square meter. In Boston, Seattle, and Chicago, it is about 145 watts per square meter. Still a lot. Reducing our future energy consumption levels rests far more with raising energy efficiency standards than assuming people will make major sacrifices in their living standards. Solar panels are not 100% efficient, so the solar energy delivered to the panel is greater than the electrical power produced by the solar panel. The best solar cells available today approach a 50% rate of converting solar energy to electricity, but the typical units that are commercially available today operate between 15% and 18% conversion rates. Thus, on average, a square meter solar panel in Phoenix, Miami, or New Orleans would deliver 30 to 36 watts of electrical power, whereas on average, the same solar panel in Boston, Seattle, or Chicago would deliver 22 to 26 watts. So, clearly, we need more solar panels in Boston, Seattle, or Chicago to get the same power than we could get with fewer solar panels in Phoenix, Miami, or New Orleans. How this general solar energy delivery system will play out in practice will then depend on the specific setting. For example, whether we are considering individual family homes, apartment buildings, or business operations. On average, American households, both in their own homes and in apartment buildings, consume about 1,250 watts of electricity per hour. Therefore, providing all of the electrical energy for an average household would require about 40 square meters in Miami or about 60 square meters in Boston. For people living in a detached house, providing all the household's energy would also require replacing fossil fuel heating and gasoline-powered vehicles. On average in the U.S., about half of the total energy consumed by single-family homes is used for heating. Fortunately, since the heat energy delivered by a heat pump is on average about 3 times larger than the heat which is delivered by electricity, supplying the same amount of heat to homes through heat pumps would only require increasing the home's solar panel area by about 16%. If one adds 2 electric cars, each of which is driven 35 miles per day, i.e. about 13,000 miles per year, that adds an additional 1,000 kilowatts to overall electricity demand. Overall, providing 100% of this household's energy using solar panels would require roughly 40 times 20 feet of solar panel area in Miami, or 50 times 25 feet in Boston. Discussion above is only directly relevant for the population living in single-family detached homes. For the U.S. population that dwells in apartments, mobile homes, or multifamily homes, the solar power delivered to the roof of the apartment building, for example, could not provide 100% of daily use. Densely packed urban populations would therefore have to use solar or wind energy that is harvested by large commercial farms and then delivered to cities. Those sources would also be needed to supply the energy for industrial use, commercial transportation, and commercial applications other than big box stores. Getting to wind energy. Wind delivers about 2 watts of energy per square meter on average. Only about 1/10 of an average solar panel on a rooftop in Chicago can produce. Wow, this is very illuminating, isn't it? In addition, wind power varies with location much more strongly than solar, because the wind energy delivered depends on the cube of the wind speed. The average wind speeds in the central U.S. are approximately twice as large as the average wind speeds in the mid-Atlantic region. As a result, a wind turbine in Iowa delivers more than 8 times as much electric power as the same wind turbine would actually deliver if it were located in Virginia. This allows Iowa to generate more than 35% of its electrical power from wind, while the wind turbines also provide farmers with significant additional stable income that augments income from raising crops and animals. However, since wind power varies so strongly with location, most inland wind power is and will continue to be generated in regions that are sparsely populated and do not consume much in electrical power. Wind speeds off the coast of the United States can be quite high. There has been great political resistance to building wind farms that are visible from coastal properties, and at present offshore wind power is much more expensive than onshore wind. As a result, in the near future, exploiting wind power will require the transport of electricity from rural regions in the central United States to urban regions with high population densities, most of which are located near the coasts. Importantly, the entire U.S. average energy consumption could be provided through siting wind turbines in about 7% of U.S. land area, or 1/6 of existing agricultural land. However, if all Americans who live in single-family homes got 100% of their energy from solar panels on their roofs, the total remaining land area requirements from large-scale solar and wind farms would obviously fall dramatically. Most of this land use requirement could be met, for example, by placing solar panels on rooftops and parking lots, then operating wind turbines on about 7% of current agricultural land. The remaining supplemental energy needs could then be supplied by geothermal, hydro, and low emissions bioenergy. Recent work also suggests that under some circumstances solar power can enhance crop growth, so there may be benefits to siting solar panels on some agricultural land. This scenario includes no further contributions from solar farms in desert areas, solar panels mounted on highways, or offshore wind projects, among other supplemental renewable energy sources, though all of these options are viable possibilities if handled responsibly. Remaining liquid energy needs for airplanes and boats. Rotating propellers move boats and small airplanes, including drones. Many propellers are already powered by electric motors. For short trips, batteries of a reasonable size can store enough energy to complete the trip. However, for long-haul ocean transport and rapid high-altitude air transport, batteries of a reasonable size cannot store enough energy for the voyage. Thus, in the foreseeable future, these systems will continue to be powered by liquid hydrocarbons. Fortunately, it has already been demonstrated that liquid hydrocarbons can be generated using entirely renewable resources. Biofuels already provide a liquid hydrocarbon, ethanol, that is combined with gasoline and fed into all the cars in the U.S. There are also non-biofuel sources of liquid hydrocarbons. For example, the Fischer-Tropsch process uses chemical interactions to convert carbon monoxide and hydrogen into liquid hydrocarbons. The carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can be harvested to provide the carbon monoxide, and renewable electrical energy can free hydrogen from water. Burning of such liquid hydrocarbons would be carbon neutral, since the energy originally came from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Importantly, if the liquid hydrocarbon is buried in the ground instead of burned, then the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere can be decreased. So certainly within a 30-year time frame, even these last remaining liquid energy requirements can be met without burning fossil fuels. Very interesting, isn't it? Intermittency, storage, and transmission. Meeting instantaneous local demand for energy is different from meeting average aggregate demand. A system designed to meet peak power demand will usually provide much more electric power than is required, whereas a system that is designed to provide the average required power will not be able to deliver when demand peaks. Even without renewables during peak demand times, it has been estimated it has been necessary to fire up fossil fuel plants that are rarely used. The cost of electricity from such plants is very high because they usually sit idle. Geothermal energy and hydropower are renewable energy sources that do not fluctuate with time. They can help to stabilize renewable energy systems. But in the U.S., hydropower cannot be significantly increased, and geothermal power is limited to certain favorable locations. matching fluctuating demand to supply can be difficult as well as wasteful. Importantly, in some cases, the fluctuations in renewable energy actually correlate with fluctuations in demand. For example, air conditioning demand is high during times when solar power delivery is also high. Thus, solar power can already deliver energy during peak air conditioning times without firing up rarely used fossil fuel resources. In general, in the morning, electricity use in solar power shows similar fractional increases with time. So in the morning, changing to solar power can reduce costly mismatches between the supply and demand for electrical power. Of course, in the late afternoon, solar power begins to decrease before electrical power use does. Science and technology are not preventing us from achieving a 100% renewable energy economy in the United States. These problems can be greatly reduced, says Mara Prentice, through energy storage. Charging electric cars offers one example. During the night, of course, solar power delivers no power, while during the day the power delivered is more than the household consumes. Electric cars with 100 kilowatt hours, 100,000 watt-hour batteries can be bought today. Thus, a household could completely disconnect from the grid. If the two-car batteries stored excess solar energy during the day, in reality, households will probably remain tied to the grid so that the cars can be driven during the day and charged wherever the car happens to be parked. At the same time, it is not clear this approach to storage, relying on lithium-ion battery technology, is optimal at a large scale. One issue with the lithium-ion batteries is their limited lifetime, which is typically a few years and less than 1,000 charge cycles. Considerable research is being devoted to other battery storage systems, and by the way, considerable progress is being made in the other battery storage systems. I don't think it's really many years away until these are going to be online. It looks like in some cases, according to some articles I've read, perhaps as few as 3 to 5 years. Excess renewable energy can pump water uphill efficiently as a large-scale energy storage system, but siting options are limited and generally are not located near population centers. Excess electrical energy can also perform hydrolysis that separates water into oxygen and hydrogen. Burning the hydrogen will produce energy in water, so hydrogen storage is possible. However, to date, large-scale hydrogen storage systems that are safe and economical do not yet exist. We already have an extremely well-developed system for storing and transporting liquid hydrocarbon fuels. So liquid hydrocarbon fuels created using renewable energy resources could provide safe, large-scale energy storage. However, this process is not yet economically viable. An alternate strategy for addressing mismatches in energy supply and demand is to build enough renewable energy to meet peak demand and then reallocate energy during low demand periods. For example, during periods of low demand, renewable energy can create some reservoirs of hot or cold liquids. Some thermal solar power systems already generate molten salt that can generate electricity when there is no sunlight. Other systems use stored hot or cold liquids to provide cooling or heating. For example, the Austin municipally owned power company uses excess electricity generated by nighttime wind power to create an ice water slurry. that is then pumped onto city streets to provide district air conditioning of much of downtown during periods of low demand. The excess electricity could also be used to generate liquid hydrocarbon fuels that store energy for later use. Similarly, if electricity prices during such periods were low, it might be economical for energy-intensive processes, such as aluminum smelting or water desalination, to run only during times when electricity supply exceeds demand. Local variations in the supply of wind and solar power can be reduced by transporting energy between regions of the U.S. Also, solar power peaks during the summer, whereas wind power in most of the U.S. is lowest during the summer. Thus, combining wind and solar can reduce the seasonal fluctuations associated with each power source separately. As noted, the technical challenges in transmitting renewable energy over long distances are not large, but long-distance transport differs from local energy delivery in significant ways. For local power delivery of electricity, the flow of electrical current alternates with time. So this type of electricity is called AC, alternating current power. Those changes with time result in a leakage of power from the electric power lines. Over short distances, that leakage is not very significant, but over long distances over land, the leakage becomes important. The leakage is even more rapid if the electricity travels in power lines that run underwater. Fortunately, if the direction of the current does not change with time, direct current, the loss for long-distance transport is greatly reduced. In addition, increasing the voltage at which the electricity flows lowers the fraction of the electrical power that leaks from the power lines. As a result, the United States already has high-voltage DC power lines that transport electricity over long distances. However, converting to 100% renewable energy would require many more lines, and these power lines are not particularly attractive. If many detached houses generated most of the energy that they use, then requirements for energy transport would be greatly reduced. In sum, science and technology are not preventing us from achieving 100% by U.S. renewable energy economy. All of the barriers are political, economic, and social. These will need to be solved if the renewable energy future is to be realized. Well, that's a beautiful, relatively brief analysis, extremely hopeful for what can be done, I think, and extremely optimistic, and I hope true. It looks like it's a pretty airtight analysis, but I'm not really qualified, to evaluate this. I'd like to see what other people have to say about that. But the important point here is that if this analysis is correct, then we're not facing insurmountable technical barriers even in the short run. She doesn't think that we're facing any barriers in getting to the kind of energy economy we need. All the barriers, she says, political, economic, and social. And I dare say, if we can overcome the political barriers first, that the economic and social barriers and cultural barriers will soon begin to follow. She says, in ending, these will need to be solved if the renewable energy future is to be realized. In a very scientific, an emotionless, final sentence. But good advice, extremely good advice, I think. So moving to my next article. It too is from the American Prospect in that special issue. That I linked to previously. And that article is called How do we pay for a zero emissions economy? And the subtitle is A Clean Economy is Affordable and the Costs of Inaction Are Incalculable. And that's by Robert by Pollan. It's written on December 5th, 2019. He, whose father was the owner of the Washington Capitals and the the Baltimore Bullets at first. I forget what they changed their name to. I'm sure they changed their name somewhere along the line, didn't they? I'm sure someone will tell me about it. Okay, I ought to know that, but I've forgotten. Okay, in any case, he was an extremely rich guy, and I think he used some of his money to provide some support to the economics department at the university. Okay, at the University of the University of Massachusetts, at Amherst. Anyway, with that as background, I also want to mention that Pollan, the younger, actually in his 60s now. I think he's in his 60s. Okay, but anyway, the younger Pollan has also made an economic case for the the Medicare for All plan, of Bernie Sanders, and has ably defended that, though always without using modern money theory. He's viewed as a very progressive economist, but he declines to talk about the capability of the federal government to do certain things with the very large increase in deficit spending. Anyway, in October 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, the most authoritative global organization advancing climate change research, issued an alarming report titled Global Warming of 1.5 degrees centigrade. This report emphasized the imperative of limiting the increase. Did I put this on clearly? I guess I did. Of limiting the increase in global mean temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels as opposed to 2.0 degrees, the previous consensus goal. The IPCC concluded that limiting the global mean temperature increase to 1.5 degrees rather than 2.0 degrees by 2100 will dramatically lower the likely negative consequences of climate change. Excuse me a second while I check on one thing. Okay, everything seems okay. Seems kosher. These include the risks of heat extremes, heavy precipitation, droughts, sea level rise, biodiversity losses, and corresponding impacts on health, livelihoods, food security, water supply, and human security. The IPCC estimates that to achieve the 1.5 degrees maximum global mean temperature increase target as of 2100, global net CO2 emissions will have to fall by about 45% as of 2030. Boy, Bernie Sanders has an awful lot of work to do and reach net zero emissions by 2050. I focus in this article on what it will take for the U.S. economy to reach net zero CO2 emissions by 2050, and specifically how we can pay for this project. In the interest of space, I do not delve into the additional specific financing challenges around also hitting the IPCC's intermediate target of a 45% CO2 emissions reduction by 2030, though important additional challenges do emerge with achieving this 2030 goal. I'm not sure the English is correct there. Purely in terms of the financing issues involved, it is an entirely reasonable and not especially difficult proposition to build a zero emissions U.S. economy by 2050. But my higher end estimate, it will require an additional level of investment spending throughout the U.S. economy of about 2% of GDP per year, focused in two areas. Quote, one, dramatically improving energy efficiency standards in the stock of buildings, automobiles, and public transportation systems, and in industrial production processes. And two, equally dramatically expanding the supply of clean renewable energy resources, primarily wind, solar, and geothermal power, which is available at competitive prices to all sectors of the U.S. economy. This level of clean energy investment spending would amount to about $400 billion in the first year of the program, which I will set as 2021, and rise to about $850 billion as of 2050, assuming the economy grows at an average rate of about 2.4% per year. As an average figure between 2021 and 2030, investment spending would then be around $600 billion per year. Total green energy investment spending for the 30-year period would amount to about $18 trillion. Now, this is just for getting to a zero emissions economy. It's not for the just transition. It's not for the Green New Deal program. We have to emphasize that. This is just for what it would cost to bring emissions down to zero. And he estimates that cost over 30 years at $18 trillion. Now, Bernie Sanders' program estimates that the cost for the Green New Deal over a 10-year period would be $16.2 trillion. So instead of an average of $600 billion a year, he would be talking $1.6 trillion per year. So it's good to keep these figures, these differences in estimates in mind. These figures are for overall investment spending, including from both the public and private sectors, whereas Bernie's estimate was for $16.2 trillion in government spending, a $1.6 trillion increase in government spending for the Green New Deal. Implicitly, I think Bernie is envisioning quite a lot more private sector spending devoted to the transition to the Green New Deal that would automatically come about as stimulus from the government spending. And Bernie's program would also envision, I think, a much greater expansion of the size of the economy because of the great increases both in public spending and in private spending, which can be envisioned if we assume the government is going to spend on the average $1.6 trillion a year over 10 years. Establishing the right mix between public and private investment will be a major consideration. As an initial rough approximation, let's assume the breakdown should be 25% public and 75% private investment. So, what Pollan is talking about here seems to be $4.5 trillion, or an average of $450 billion a year from the government, which is, since GDP is going to be growing over this time, it probably amounts to maybe 1 to 1.5% of GDP in increased government spending over a period of time. In the first year of the project in 2021, this would break down to $100 billion in public investments, along with $300 billion in private funds. So Pollan's estimates here are envisioning a relatively small amount of money spending on getting to a zero emissions economy alone. So if he's correct about that, not much of the Sanders average budget of $1.6 trillion per year would need to be allocated, just strictly speaking, to the problem of getting to zero emissions in the first year. Okay, I'd like to know how these two different estimates of things would articulate with each other. I think that's an interesting question. A major part of the policy challenge will be to determine how to leverage the public money most effectively to create strong incentives for private investors. Before plunging into the financing details, I need to emphasize a critical point at the outset. This clean energy investment project will pay for itself in full over time because it will deliver low energy costs for all U.S. energy consumers. This results because raising energy efficiency standards means that, by definition, consumers will spend less for a given amount of energy services, such as being able to travel 100 miles on a gallon of gasoline with high-efficiency hybrid plug-in vehicle, as opposed to 25 miles per gallon with the average car on U.S. roads today. Moreover, the cost of supplying energy through wind, solar, geothermal, and hydropower are now on average roughly equal to or lower than those for fossil fuels and for nuclear energy. As such, the initial upfront investment outlays can be repaid over time through the cost savings that will be forthcoming. In addition to building a clean energy infrastructure, this new investment will be a major new source of job creation at all levels of the U.S. labor market, in the range of 7.5 million jobs on average between 2021 and 2050. This is true even while recognizing that the workers and communities in the U.S. whose livelihoods depend on the fossil fuel industry will inevitably be hurt as this industry contracts step by step to zero between now and 2050. Advancing generous, quote, just transition, unquote, policies for the affected workers and communities needs to be a central element of the overall clean energy investment project. Harold Meyerson discusses these critical questions around job creation and just transition policies elsewhere in this issue. We will go over Meyerson's article in a future live stream. For 2018, clean energy investments in the U.S. economy amounted to about $64 billion, equal to about 0.3% of GDP. We therefore need to expand clean energy investments roughly sixfold in very short order to get to the 2% of GDP target. This really seems like small potatoes to me. Doesn't it seem like that to you? And then maintain this heightened level of spending relative to GDP until 2050. At one level, this is obviously a daunting challenge. On the other hand, it does still mean that 98% of economic activity in the U.S. can proceed largely independent of the clean energy investment project. Please no, we don't want it to be independent. Why 2% of GDP? To show that my spending estimates are not based on a lot of hocus pocus, I should describe where the 2% of GDP figure comes from. This estimate is derived directly from the figures on costs in the U.S. to achieve either a given improvement in energy efficiency or a given increase in the clean renewable energy supply. The U.S. economy presently consumes a total of about 100 quadrillion British thermal units, QBTUs, of energy from all fossil fuel, nuclear, and renewable energy sources. As a high-end estimate, working from the research literature, I assume it will cost about $30 billion to achieve 1 QBTU of energy savings relative to the consumption level that would result through a business-as-usual economic trajectory between now and 2050. From this, I calculate that it will cost a total of about $3.3 trillion over the 30-year investment cycle, or about $100 billion per year on average, to stabilize overall U.S. energy consumption at about 110 QBTUs as of 2050. For year one, energy efficiency investments would be about $70 billion. Whereas 1% of GDP is about $201 billion, just for comparison. This clean energy investment project will pay for itself in full over time because it will deliver lower energy costs for all U.S. consumers. To operate the U.S. economy totally through clean energy sources as of 2050, that means we need a total of 110 QBTUs of clean energy supply. At present, total supply of wind, solar, hydro, and geothermal is about 6 QBTUs. We therefore need to expand supply by 104 QBTUs by 2050. Again, working from the research literature, a high-end figure for the average cost of expanding renewable energy supply between 2021 and 2050 is about $150 billion per QBTU. Thus, over the 30-year investment cycle, we need to spend a total of roughly $14.6 trillion on clean energy capital expenditures, or a bit less than $500 billion per year on average. For year one, the spending level would be about $330 billion. The total average investment spending level will therefore need to be about $600 billion per year, with $500 billion going to renewable investments and $100 billion to efficiency projects. Boy, that is really small potatoes, especially compared to what's in the Green New Deal program of Bernie Sanders. Average GDP between 2021 and 2050 will be about $30 trillion if the U.S. economy grows at 2.4% per year, which is, in my view, a low rate of growth. Historically, in some periods, like the period from, from 1945 to 1970, I believe we grew faster than that. And, of course, the Chinese economy continuously grows far faster than that. We know that growth far faster than that, especially when the growth is devoted to renewable investments and to draining carbon from the air and to increasing our real sustainability. That kind of economic growth is absolutely possible for us. This is how we reach the conclusion that clean energy investments will need to average about 2% of GDP per year between 2021 and 2050, i.e. $600 billion in investments divided by $30 trillion in GDP. That is an average of $30 trillion per year, in GDP over that particular period. Over the period of the 30 years, what are we talking about? 900 trillion in total GDP over the whole 30-year period. As noted above, we are assuming that of the full $400 billion in spending that will be required in year one, $100 billion will come from the federal government, with the remaining $300 billion supplied by private investors. We also assume that the $300 billion in private investment funding will not be forthcoming without strong and large-scale public policy interventions. We therefore need to answer two big questions with the financing proposal: where to get $100 billion a year in new federal government funds, and how to cost-effectively induce the additional $300 billion in private funds. The table right provides a guide for following the main features of my proposed plan. Where to get $100 billion in federal government money. As of 2018, the federal government budget was $4.1 trillion. The $100 billion budget for federal clean energy investment I'm proposing will therefore amount to only 2.5% of the overall budget. Nevertheless, these funds will need to come from someplace. I propose three funding sources: a carbon tax, in which 75% of revenues are rebated back to the public, but 25% are channeled into clean energy investment projects. 2, transferring funds out of the military budget, particularly from its nuclear weapons program. And 3, a Federal Reserve-based green bond lending program. Well, I'm all for transferring funds out of the military budget for other reasons, just because I'd like to see some funds. I won't say transferring funds, but I'm all for cuts, okay, in the military budget. I just think the cuts are an independent question from the funding, from this funding. So essentially my recommendation would be, let's fund this by deficit spending the amount of money we need, simply deficit spending the whole amount. Let's fund it, okay, in that way. And let's not sell any bonds. Let's just deficit spending without actually selling any bonds. Okay. I guarantee that the $100 billion in extra spending without floating any bonds will not, in the present economy, result in increased inflation, because there's plenty of slack in this economy for $100 billion worth of additional public spending. That's really small potatoes. Strong cases can be made for each of these funding measures, but each proposal does also have vulnerabilities, including around political feasibility. The most sensible approach is therefore to combine the measures into a single package that minimizes their respective weaknesses as stand-alone initiatives. This whole thing, I mean, his recommendations are really based on the idea that our political system is going to minimally change. They totally ignore the possibility that Bernie Sanders is going to be successful and that we are going to have his revolution in our political system. Anyway, we'll have to see what happens. It seems to me that this suggestion for funding it could well be handled by any of the Democratic candidates. They could even be it could even be handled by Joe Biden. It's as if he decided, okay, to design a minimal funding program that would not be dependent on who won the presidency in 2020. It's an interesting approach. Unfortunately, it doesn't solve any structural problems in our economy. Carbon tax with rebates. As noted by James Boyce elsewhere in this issue, carbon taxes have the merit of impacting climate policy through two channels. They raise fossil fuel prices and therefore discourage consumption, while also generating a new source of revenue for the government. A source of revenue the government does not need, of course, as we know. At least part of the carbon tax revenue can then be channeled into supporting the clean energy investment project. That, of course, is not how the funding system works in the federal government. We also know that. But the carbon tax will hit low and middle income people disproportionately, since they spend a large fraction of their income on electricity, gasoline, and home heating fuel. So why have the carbon tax? I mean, I'd rather ration the carbon. I'd much rather ration the carbon, so everybody suffers equally. An equal shares rebate, as proposed by Boyce, is the simplest way to ensure that the full impact of the tax will be equalized across the population. Well, that is better. That is certainly better. But I still think the money doesn't need to be removed from the economy. So maybe all we ought to do is assess the carbon tax on the rich. But of course, it's not going to restrict their carbon consumption, right? Okay. Consider, therefore, the following tax and rebate program. Focusing again on year one, we begin the tax at a low rate of $20 per ton of carbon. Given current U.S. CO2 emissions levels, that would generate about $100 billion in revenue. If we use only 25% of this revenue to finance clean energy investment, that amounts to $25 billion for investment projects. This would cover about 25% of the $100 billion total federal funding needed for the clean energy investment project. 75% of the total revenue that is rebated to the public in equal shares would amount to about $230 for every U.S. resident, or nearly $1,000 for a family of four. The average price of gasoline would rise by about 7%, from about $2.70 to $2.90 per gallon. Hey, I think most of us could afford that. Taking from the U.S. military budget, the U.S. military budget in 2018 was about $700 billion. We would therefore need to devote about 14% of the military budget to clean energy transformation to fully fund the $100 billion in total federal funding for the clean energy investment project. This would be an entirely justifiable transfer of funds. See, he still looks at funds as transfers. It's always transfers. It's never the Federal Reserve creating entirely new funds, always, which is really what happens on both logical and ethical grounds. If we take at face value the idea that U.S. defense spending should be about protecting the well-being of citizens. But on political grounds, it would represent an implausibly large military spending cut. A more realistic approach would be to allow that the transfer out of the military budget would, like the carbon tax funds, be at $25 billion. This would require a transfer of about 4% out of the military budget. These funds could be raised through a 4% across-the-board military spending cut. A more targeted approach would be to cut by 50% the average annual $50 billion budget now devoted to nuclear weapons development. Given that, along with climate change, the existence of nuclear weapons is a true existential threat to life on Earth, this would be a fitting approach to funding the clean energy investment project. Well, certainly not opposed to cutting the budget for new nuclear weapons development by 50% or by 75% or maybe even by the whole thing, but we don't need to do that to fund this. Federal Reserve green bond funding. It was demonstrated during the 2007 to 2009 financial crisis and subsequent recession. The Federal Reserve is willing and able to supply basically unlimited bailout funds to Wall Street during crises. The extensive 2017 study, The Cost of the Crisis by Better Markets, documents this carefully. Given the first few years of following the onset of crisis, the government committed approximately $12.2 trillion to stop the crash of the financial system, stabilize the economy, and try to spur our economic growth. Of that massive total, $9 trillion was allocated to bailing out Wall Street's too-big-to-fail banks with direct investments in financial institutions, purchases of high-grade corporate debt, and purchases of mortgage-backed securities. $1.7 trillion was allocated to insuring debt issued by financial institutions and guaranteeing poorly performing assets, and $1.5 trillion went to a significant expansion of the government's traditional overnight lending to banks. There doesn't seem to be a consideration in here of the amount used on a revolving basis in the form of credit facilities provided by the Federal Reserve to the Wall Street banks. In a study done, I believe it was done in 2012, or certainly as early as 2012, there was a study done by some of Randy Wray's students, at the Levy Institute, that showed that up to that time, during the crisis, there had been credit facilities that were made available to the too-big-to-fail banks that totaled $29 trillion. Now, this was in revolving credit facilities, so I don't think it was all at once, but it was a huge amount of money. And even though there were no calculations done after, whenever the study was done in 2012 or 2013 or 2011, I forget one, exactly, there was no follow-on study showing how much in credit facilities has been supplied to the banks since that time. I wouldn't be surprised that we'd be looking at $39 trillion or $49 trillion in credit facilities over this whole period. Seems funny that that is not mentioned here. What also became clear through these bailout operations is that there were no binding rules prohibiting the Fed from intervening in the private financial market in any ways it deemed appropriate. Yes, but didn't we know that before? I mean, we knew that before. We couldn't find any binding rules in any laws, could we? I would propose $50 billion in green bond financing supplied by the Fed, which would then match the $25 billion each coming from both the carbon tax and the military budget transfers. This would amount to a minuscule 0.4% of the Fed's Wall Street bailout operations during the crisis. Well, probably they're still going on with many of these bailout operations right now. So I wonder what it amounts to as a percent of the current bailout operations that the Fed is using to continually support the Wall Street banks. It is true that the Wall Street bailouts during the crisis were a dramatic deviation from normal Fed operating practices induced by the incipient global financial collapse, but it's also obviously true that we human beings now face a far more dire crisis resulting from climate change. So therefore, we should only devote a minuscule 0.4% of the Wall Street bailout operation, right? The Fed's funding support could be injected into the economy through straightforward channels. That is, federal, state, and municipal governments could issue long-term, zero-interest rate green bonds. The Federal Reserve would purchase these bonds The various levels of government would then have the funds to pursue the full range of projects that will fall under the rubric of the $100 billion in public funds needed to finance the clean energy investment project. Why not just have the Federal Reserve just simply create the $50 billion and put it in the Treasury spending account without any issuance of bonds? I mean, why? Why? Why not? In other words, we can raise the funds needed without any general tax increase. The next administration may well want to repeal the $4 trillion Trump tax cut, or selectively raise taxes on the wealthy to finance other public needs. But a general tax increase is not needed to get to zero carbon. That's right. Nor are military budget cuts, nor are green bonds. Moving the $300 billion into clean energy investments can be accomplished through a combination of sticks and carrots, i.e., strong regulations that require CO2 emissions cuts and significant subsidies for investors to invest in clean energy projects. In other words, more candy for those who can afford it. Okay, all right. Joan Fitzgerald's article in this issue describes in depth a range of effective regulatory interventions, including renewable energy portfolio standards for electrical utilities and energy efficiency standards of both buildings and transportation vehicles. Focusing on the subsidy side, there are several tools that can be effectively deployed, all of which are already in place or have been recently operating at some levels of the state, local, or federal government. An obvious starting point is tax incentives. It was telling that in the 2018 federal tax legislation, the Trump administration flinched before eliminating the generous investment tax credits provided for the private clean energy investors. At present, that credit amounts to fully 30% of the total investment cost. Public policy can also significantly lower the risk and therefore the cost to private investors of borrowing money to finance clean energy projects. One important tool here is property assessed clean energy PACE financing. Under typical PACE financing arrangements, property owners borrow from a local government or bank to finance clean energy investments. The amount borrowed is then repaid via a special assessment on property taxes or another locally collected tax or bill. The security of the tax collection mechanism reduces the risk to private lenders or bond investors, which in turn means that financing can be obtained at lower rates. Several states, including California, Florida, and New York, which themselves comprise nearly 25% of the U.S. population, have PACE financing programs presently in operation. These and similar programs in other states will need to expand greatly to help bring overall private clean energy investments to $300 billion. Why don't we just make these publicly funded investments? In Bernie Sanders' program, there are grants that are going to go to property owners to make investments on their home. Why have the people borrow? Why increase their debts, even at low interest rates? They have enough debt programs right now. Debt problems right now. Government loan guarantees are probably the most cost-effective way for the government to provide large-scale subsidies to private sector borrowing for clean energy investment projects. Evidence for this comes from a loan guarantee program for renewable energy investments that was enacted 2009 as part of the Obama economic stimulus program, the ARRA. This loan guarantee program became notorious as a symbol of government ineptitude when Solyndra, a Northern California-based manufacturer of solar panels, declared bankruptcy in 2011. The federal government was therefore obligated to pay Solyndra's creditors the full $535 million of Solyndra's outstanding guarantee loans. But the program also generated successes, as noted by Mariana Mazzucato in a companion article in this issue. The fair way to evaluate the relative success of the loan guarantee program is to consider the Solyndra experience alongside the complete portfolio of other renewable energy projects that the ARRA program subsidized. Overall, under this ARRA-based program, the federal government provided guarantees for a total of about $14 billion for 24 clean energy projects. Of these, there was one other default case in addition to Solyndra, but once one accounts for the government having recovered about 50% of its costs through selling the assets of the two bankrupt firms, the net federal costs of the program were about $300 million. This implies the government spent $300 million to support $14 billion in new private clean energy investments, amounting to a leverage ratio of 50 in clean energy investments for every $1 in government subsidies. Very good. I mean, very good. The leverage ratio, okay, is very good. But again, why make people go into debt? Why not simply grant them the funds? Especially where the grants are going to households for heat pumps and for solar panels on the roofs. What's wrong with that? If this leverage ratio could be applied to the overall clean energy investment project I am outlining, it would mean that only $6 billion in government outlays would be sufficient to induce the full $300 billion in new private sector clean energy investments. Such an elevated leverage ratio will not likely be achievable for a broader loan guarantee program. One reason is that we do not know what percentage of the $14 billion total in new investments under the ARRA program would have happened anyway without the government guaranteeing the private investors' loans. It is also true that achieving a high leverage ratio will be more difficult when operating the program at a much larger scale, i.e. in trying to raise $300 billion as opposed to $14 billion. Still, while recognizing these considerations, it is reasonable to allow for a leverage ratio in the range of 10 to 1, 1/5 of the ratio that emerged out of the ARRA program. That would still mean the federal government would need to spend a total of only $30 billion in loan guarantees to fully underwrite $300 billion in private clean energy investments. This is without taking account of the other incentives to investors accruing through the investment tax credits, PACE financing, or other risk-reducing policy interventions. In fact, these various policies will be most effective when operating in tandem. Through their combined impacts, it should not be excessively difficult to bring total private clean energy investments to the $300 billion target. Well, I certainly agree with that. I think that his program makes sense when looked at from a neoliberal point of view, but I don't think it necessarily follows that it looks as good from an MMT point of view, because again, the $400 billion per year, the total $400 billion per year, could be covered through federal grants, which can be deficit spent. Deficit spending in the economy right now is far too low. It is only $1 trillion, even taking into account the wasteful spending of Donald Trump. It's only $1 trillion. Therefore, we are opening ourselves up by not fully accounting for the current account deficit, okay, and the money withdrawn from the economy due to savings. since we're not spending enough to counterbalance these two leakages of demand from the economy, we need higher deficit spending. What better use could there be for the higher deficit spending than to spend the whole $400 billion on Pollan's program that he's proposing here? Climate insurance and the cost of doing nothing. What will happen if we do not succeed in stabilizing the climate? MIT climate scientist Bakary Emanuel offered the following perspectives in his 2012 book, What We Know About Climate Change. There will be more frequent and more intense heat waves. Previously fertile areas in the subtropics may become may be barren, and blights may seriously affect both natural vegetation and crops, unquote. Quote again, comparatively small shifts in precipitation and temperature can exert considerable pressure on government and social systems whose failures to respond could lead to famine, also disease, to mass emigrations, and political instability. Quote, were the entire Greenland ice cap to melt, sea level would increase by about 22 feet, flooding many coastal regions, including much of the southern Florida and lower Manhattan. 11 of the 15 largest cities of the world are located on coastal estuaries, and all would be affected, unquote. More recently, the November 2018 Fourth National Climate Assessment of the U.S. federal government, led by NOAA, was equally emphatic in describing the likely consequences of failing to control climate change. This report, focusing only on impacts within the United States, begins with the following overview. More frequent and intense extreme weather and climate-related events, as well as changes in average climate conditions, are expected to continue to damage infrastructure, ecosystems, and social systems that are going to provide essential benefits to communities. Future climate change is expected to further disrupt areas of life, exacerbating existing challenges to prosperity posed by aging and deteriorating infrastructure, stressed ecosystems, and economic inequality. At the same time, as all serious studies on the impact of climate change fully recognize, every projection as to the impacts of climate change must be understood in terms of the probabilities and degrees of confidence, not certainties. In fact, we need to take decisive action now on climate change, not based on 100% certainty as to its consequences, but rather through estimating some reasonable probabilities. Indeed, we should think of the U.S. Clean Energy Project as the equivalent of an insurance policy to protect ourselves and the planet against the serious prospect, though not the certainty, the types of consequences described by Emanuel and NOAA could result. It's nice to think of it as an insurance policy. Only problem is we have a case of one, our world. That's the only experience we have, and insurance policies are based on many, many cases and statistical analysis, of those cases. I think we have to evaluate this in terms, of likelihoods, and I think we have to get our likelihood of success extremely high. Of course, we can never have it at 100% of certainty, but we need to get our likelihood of success as close to 100% as is humanly possible, because we have only this one world to spend. Anyway, going further, we purchase insurance to protect ourselves against many other contingencies, such as house fires, automobile accidents, or serious illnesses. We do this even though we have no idea whether our house may ever burn down or our car will get totaled in an accident. From this perspective, the only major issue in dispute is how much we should be willing to pay to purchase an adequate amount of climate insurance. This is the equivalent of deciding not whether to purchase automobile insurance, but rather how much to spend and how much coverage we need. In addressing this question, it is critical. God, I hate to get into the use of household analogies here. This isn't about household analogies or how much we as individuals will spend. We have a government. And that government spends in its own currency. It can spend what it needs to solve this problem and fulfill this need. When are people going to start talking in this vein? Like this? This is, after all, about survival. How much will we spend to survive? Well, if we have a government that can spend as much as it needs to survive, the answer is we'll spend as much as we need to survive. In addressing this question, it is critical to recall the point I emphasized at the outset, that the net cost of the clean energy investment project will be zero over time. That is, the program will pay for itself over time because, one, the energy efficiency investments will enable all energy consumers to spend less money to obtain the energy services they want, and two, the costs of clean renewable energy are already at cost parity with fossil fuels, and these costs will be falling further through additional innovations. Again, he's talking dollar costs when he should be talking costs in real resources. In terms of real resources, when we're talking essentially renewable energy, we're talking about costs that are renewable. They go away. They go away. The fossil fuels go into the atmosphere. They cause harm. And eventually there are no fossil fuels left. They do go away in the short run. There's no comparison in the cost at all. No comparison when we're talking about the real costs. We will need to invest something like $18 trillion over a 30-year period to build 100% clean energy infrastructure in the United States. But these investments will come back to us through lowering the cost of consuming the energy we need for all our various purposes. After accounting for the full range of factors at play with the U.S. Clean Energy Project, we can conclude that on balance, the cost of purchasing global climate change insurance will be modest. It is an insurance policy we can unquestionably afford to pay for, even if in the unlikely event the prevailing scientific consensus on climate change does turn out to be wrong. The alternative to not purchasing this insurance policy is effectively to play Russian roulette with the fate of the earth. And what I say is to not spend whatever we have to spend to avoid the result that we've been rushing towards, okay, is going to be worth it. It doesn't matter if it's how much did he say? 18 trillion over 30 years, or whether it's 72 trillion over 30 years, or whether it's 150 trillion, okay, over 30 years. We are going to have to spend it, because the alternative to not spending it is to play Russian roulette with the fate of the earth. And it's even less excusable when we consider that the cost of producing money for the federal government is close to zero. Is close to zero. In real costs, it requires only a little use of electricity. Well, it costs more if you talk about the administrative costs of deciding when and where to add the $150 trillion or the $200 trillion or whatever the hell, okay, it's going to cost. Okay, I like this article, okay, in many ways. It lays out the kinds of things we have to have, but obviously I don't like it when it comes to his talking about the cost of funds. It's all according to the older neoliberal paradigm. I can't stand that. He's tacitly assuming that the only sources of federal funds are taxing and borrowing. And this is just not true. And I just don't want to, I just get irritated when, okay, I keep seeing these kinds of accounts from people who by now, they know enough at least to doubt the truth of the idea that the only sources are tax revenues and borrowing private funds. And Bonnie writes a note for me. She says, there are fish dying now and sections of the ocean without fish. Yes, there are dead zones, of course. We know there are now dead zones. We already have them now. And we have to make them alive again. And we have to expand the Green New Deal to a Blue Ocean New Deal, okay, or to a Blue New Deal. There was a plan that was just released, okay, by Elizabeth Warren that calls attention, okay, to the need for a Blue New Deal, okay, as well as a Green New Deal. I think it unjustifiably assumes that the Green New Deal doesn't already include the Blue New Deal in it. I think there are hints in the Sanders plan, okay, to suggest that his plan actually does already include that. But it was valuable to see the Warren write-up, okay, in any case, and I think it's a good write-up, okay, for you to take a look at. So, that's all I have to say about the articles in the special issue of the American Prospect and, on getting to the Green New Deal. Obviously, we can see that all the articles are not specifically about the Green New Deal or consistent with the Green New Deal, but they deal, okay, with parts of it. And some of them, such as this article, are rather neutral when it comes to the Green New Deal. In other words, they're consistent with it, but they could be paid for by Joe Biden in the kind of spending that he's proposed as yet. So, anyway, we ought to keep that in mind. Anyway, I'm going to end this part of it now. I'm going to take your comments in a very short period of time, but I wanted to call your attention to a YouTube video that was produced by The Real News. I put the link down in the description, so you should have the link to this. But this is a video where Mark Steiner is interviewing has a Bill Black interview, and this interview is very funny. It's very illuminating. It's full of facts. In one way, it supports the Democrats' case for impeachment in kind of a minimal way. It supports it and shows easily, very easily, that it is totally justified by itself. But it grants that since impeachment is a political matter, that may or may not be decisive, and then Bill goes on, okay, to talk about the whole case for impeaching Trump for corruption, arguing that his administration is the most corrupt administration in history, full of high crimes, full of misdemeanors, full of illegal things. It's not a case which the Democrats would wish to bring out, because Democratic administrations have been guilty of similar things themselves, but not to the extent of the Trump administration, which from day one has been full of corruption. So, I'm not going to go through this video here, but I commend it to you highly. Bill Black does a wonderful job. The video is terribly entertaining, as well as terribly instructive. When Bill and Mark Steiner from The Real News come together, they almost always have a really, really good time. It's very, very entertaining because Bill is so funny. Okay. Okay, and he and Mark always get very close to rolling on the floor laughing. So anyway, I recommend this to you highly. And on that note, I'm going to shift my view and take your comments and your questions. And there may even be some of you who want to talk a little about impeachment, because okay, I noticed that Kay seemed to be very interested in that. She was very frustrated today by the impeachment process. Anyway, that is part 2. And, okay, there we go. Honey, could you shift off the overhead lights for me, please?
Sure.
Thanks. Okay, Bonnie is sitting right here tonight, so she can help to shift the overhead lights off, so you can see me a bit better. Oh, unfortunately, Kay is gone.
Answer her tomorrow.
Okay, well, if Kay's still here, that's fine. If you're not still here, then Kay, if you happen to check in on this. I'll be back tomorrow at the usual time, okay, around the usual time, which is 9:10, provided I don't have any technical difficulties. And if I don't, I will go on further with this. Here we go. Okay. So, Lana joined and Rob joined. Hey, Rob. And Rob asked if do I have a fan on, Yoda? Not to my knowledge, but the fan might have been on my system. There might have been some heating problems, and the fan might have been trying to cool it off. In other words, the internal fan on the computer, which I can't really turn down. But that was the only fan I had on. McKay said, we had a heat pump when I lived in southeastern of North Carolina. I love it. Yeah, we had a heat pump when we lived, okay, in Reston, Virginia, okay, in our house there. And we also had a heat pump in Chantilly, as a matter of fact, right. And we even had solar panels on our house, okay, at that time, because the Carter administration gave some tax incentives for putting solar panels on your house. But of course, the solar panels of that time were nowhere near as efficient as the solar panels, okay, of this time. So that's true as well. Steve Wolfbrand joined, and Randy Hedgebeth. Hey, Randy, how are you? Steve says, the doc is a genius. Pretty sure he's got a DeLorean that time travels. And Kay says, yes, I remember the DeLorean that time travels. Okay, says they can put solar panels on the roofs of cars so they charge as you drive them too. Yeah, and there can be also solar cells on roads now. Also, they've been experimenting with them. I believe in the Netherlands. Okay, as well. And the solar energy can be transferred to your car to recharge the batteries as you drive on the solar roads.
They used it for riding on bicycles.
Yes, and it can be used for bicycle paths also. And Cheyenne has joined, says, I am mourning Jeremy Corbyn's loss. The world I really needed him. Yes, Cheyenne, I am mourning his loss too. I wish that he had more cleverly handled this and that he had taken a position in support, okay, of Brexit, in support, okay, of the decision that was made by the referendum, but that he would have argued that he was much more capable, okay, of actually bringing the Europeans, to the table, so that there wouldn't have been such a hard Brexit, okay, if he was the prime minister. He used to be clearly for Brexit, okay, at one time, but he moderated his stance to accommodate some internal party needs. Then his position became extremely complicated, and he could not compete with the simple position, okay, of Boris Johnson. If he had essentially matched the Brexit position, okay, of Johnson, but also ran on the anti-austerity campaign, I think then he might have won. But anyway, Kay says, me too, Cheyenne. See. The Brits will wish they hadn't made this mistake. They will. They will. Because Boris is really going to hurt them with the power he has now as a prime minister with a big majority in the House of Commons. He can do anything he wants to. If he wants to privatize the NHS, he's going to privatize it. And those Brits that we've been seeing in the interviews that have come over here, talking about how wonderful the NHS is, the gift that keeps on giving, and making fun of Americans because of the cost we pay for ambulances and the cost that we pay for our drugs and things like that. That's been, really, really bad. I hope you've been sharing, liking, and subscribing, and remembering my Patreon account, www.patreon.com/Joe_Firestone. And Cheyenne says apparently there was some rigging going on, but I'm not able to verify it. It's harder to rig in the UK. Their election stuff, I think, is very well established. I think the voter suppression is much harder. Cheyenne says, thanks, Dr. Joe. Sorry I can't stay on. You're doing a great job. Well, thank you for coming, Cheyenne. Happy to see you. Kay says maybe the Russians had some interference going on there too. Wait until their national health care gets privatized. But Boris is working on that with our orange idiot, from what I have been hearing. Yes, but I don't think our orange idiot has a time to negotiate a treaty and get it through Congress before the election. And since I still think Bernie's going to win here, then there's going to be no trade treaty with the UN that requires that they privatize the NHS. That is not going to happen. Not going to happen. Cheyenne says, Boris is the UK's Trump. Jeremy is the UK's Bernie. Well, I think off the campaign he just ran, okay, I'm going to say Bernie is smarter than Jeremy. And the same thing's not going to happen to Bernie. Boris was caught trying to hide from the press in a refrigerator. Seriously, I know. I watched that clip also. Didn't stop him from getting elected. Because the people were angry at what went on with the Brexit, and Labour got out of touch on that. If they got out of touch with the people on that, they would have known that they couldn't afford to go against the Brexit sentiment. I mean, this election, in large part, is due to the position that Corbyn and Labour took on Brexit. They really needed to go along with what the majority thought when it came to Brexit. They made it look like they weren't going to support the democratically expressed will of the people. That's all. Kay says, millions of jobs will generate change our economy vis-a-vis the Green New Deal. Yeah, there are going to be 20 million new jobs, at least, that are going to be generated by the Green New Deal. And as our population expands, more and more and more jobs are going to be generated by the Green New Deal. And Kay says, laugh out loud, I saw that hiding in the fridge post too. He will have to be hiding wherever he can when he does the death toll on their health service and the economy too. Cheyenne, laugh out loud. Yeah. Well, good job. Good info, Joe, but I need to go to bed. Thank you for being here tonight. I think what you mean is, thank you for getting here tonight. Yeah. Thank you very much, Kay. And Sherry says, there is an opportunity right now in the next few years to impact the farm sector in ways that don't involve carbon taxes, which are unpopular. Many farmers are aging out of the industry, but farming is so capital intensive that it is extremely hard to get into farming. Plus, the more they borrow, the more they're under control under the banks in terms of managing their farms. This seems to me a great opportunity to bring the younger farmers on board who can be drawn into adopting environmentally friendly techniques. Much of the farm sector is extremely conservative and skeptical or even hostile to the government. As a result, government requirements and taxes piss them off. A Green New Deal that brings the needs of farmers into consideration can reduce or even turn this around, in my opinion. I agree with you, Sherry, and I think the outlines for that Green New Deal for farming are in Bernie's platform. I really think that that would help, okay? And I also think that Bernie needs to look hard at the old Farmers Home Administration, which I happen to have the privilege of consulting for, first at the Census Bureau and also working within the Department of Agriculture between the years 1977 and 1983. Actually, I was pushed out when Reagan took over in the spring, of 1983. But I was working on some formula funding projects for the Farmers Home Administration, at that time. And I came to know the agency fairly well, and they had a lot of good programs for farmers. Unfortunately, a lot of them were for big farmers, but there were also a good many for small farmers as well and for local communities. And they were funneling quite a bit of federal spending into those communities. But between the Reagan administration and the Clinton administration and the Bush administration, the two Bush administrations, the Farmers Home Administration was destroyed. I think, if I recall correctly, it was destroyed in the early 2000s. It's a damn shame. Maybe Bernie ought to look at reinventing and modernizing something like the Farmers Home Administration. Thank you for your comment, Sherry. And Byron has joined. Actually, Byron Montgomery. Hi, Byron. Okay, the group of you here is now very small, and I've been on now for close to 2 hours. So I am going to leave you now. I'll be on tomorrow at roughly 9 o'clock, from 9 to 9:10 or so. I hope, if I don't encounter any technical problems in getting on again. I don't see why I should. This is the first time that Facebook has kicked out, has dropped its tie with the XSplit application. I've set up a permanent tie with them. It shouldn't have broken down, but I had to reestablish the tie tonight, before I could go on. So anyway, thank you very much for coming, and I'm going to end this now. And the YouTube version will probably be up within 20 minutes or so. Thanks again for coming. Good night.